You think you know people, don't you? You see their worn-out faces, their routine lives, their little quirks, and you assume there's nothing deeper to uncover. That's what I thought about Mr. Parson, my grumpy, disheveled landlord.
Just an old man, right?
Just someone to dodge when rent was due. But then life threw me into his world, first out of desperation, and then out of curiosity. What I discovered behind his apartment door wasn't just secrets. It was a side of him, of myself, that I never expected to find. And now, I'm not sure I'll ever see either of us the same way again. I'm a 20-year-old with fiery red hair, blue eyes, and freckles. I've always been told I'm pretty, and honestly, I think that's the only reason Mr. Parson hasn't thrown me out yet. But this time, I'm in trouble. I don't have the money, not even close. Last week, someone stole my wallet and phone. I've been barely scraping by, borrowing money just to eat. It feels like everything is falling apart, and now I don't know how much longer I can dodge Mr. Parson's patience. Mr. Parson is a short, slightly bald, and slightly chubby man in his 60s. He always walks around a little disheveled, as if he doesn't care much about his appearance. He can be grumpy, and honestly, who wouldn't be with tenants who owe rent? But I've always thought he seemed like a decent guy underneath. And if he'd dress up and look better, I might actually think he'd be kind of cute. Don't judge me, I've always had a thing for older men. The strangest thing about him, though, are the rumors in the building. People say that many years ago, he was a star in the adult film industry. Looking at him now, it's hard to picture that. It almost feels like some weird joke, but who knows? Secrets hide in the most unexpected people. After thinking it over, I decided to take a chance. I put on my best clothes, put on some makeup, and looked at myself in the mirror. He won't be able to say no to this pretty face, I said out loud, trying to convince myself more than anything. I was ready to use all my charms on Mr. Parson. With a mix of confidence and embarrassment, I walked down the hall and knocked on his door. He opened it, looking as disheveled as ever, his shirt wrinkled, his hair a mess, and the faint smell of something fried lingering in the air. His eyes squinted at me before he said in a gruff tone, "Oh, it's you. Don't think I haven't noticed you sneaking around and hiding from me. So, I assume you're here to pay up? 3 months, and now heading into the 4th? His words hit me like a slap, and for a moment, I forgot everything I had planned to say. I told him my story, my voice trembling, tears threatening to spill. I explained everything, my stolen wallet, my phone, my borrowed money for food. But instead of sympathy, he just laughed. "No more stories," he said, his tone cold. "Either you pay today or you're out." I wasn't expecting that. Panicking, I blurted out, "Maybe we could make an arrangement." As soon as the words left my mouth, his expression changed. He looked me up and down, his gaze lingering too long. I could swear he licked his lips. A faint smirk crossed his face. "We might be able to come to an agreement," he said slowly, his voice dropping. "But I don't think it's the kind you're imagining." "I'll do anything," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. His eyes widened slightly, as if processing the possibilities. "Please," I added, desperation creeping in. "I need your help." He tilted his head, studying me for a moment, then gestured toward his apartment door. "Why don't you come in, and we can discuss it?" As I stepped inside, I noticed him glance down the hallway, checking if anyone was watching before closing the door behind me. The air in his apartment was stuffy, the faint smell of old furniture and beer lingering. "Take a seat," he said, motioning toward the worn couch. A moment later, he handed me a cold beer, the condensation dripping onto my fingers. I took it, holding it tightly but not drinking. He settled into a chair across from me, his gaze unwavering. "So, you need more time to pay?" he asked, his tone almost casual. I nodded quickly. "Yes, please. I'll figure something out soon, I swear." He leaned back, sipping his beer and watching me. "We can work something out," he said, his voice slow, deliberate. "But what exactly can you do for me in return?" "I could help with cleaning," I offered, my voice trembling slightly. He scoffed immediately. "Hell no," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. I blinked, confused. "Then what?" He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied me, a hint of amusement curling the corners of his lips. "There are days I feel lonely," he began, his tone shifting. "Maybe you could keep me company." "What do you mean by company?" I asked, though deep down, I already knew where this was heading. He stood and walked over to me, lowering himself beside me on the couch. "I'm a poor, lonely old man. Don't think I want to take advantage of you," he said, his voice thick and slow. He gave me a look that I couldn't mistake, his smile almost playful, but his eyes dark. "Very nervous," I answered. "What do you want me to do?" "Not much. I just want to admire you. Why don't you dance for me?" "I'll stay seated," he answered. I was very nervous. Although I thought about using my charms with Mr. Parson, I couldn't believe what I was about to do. My hand shook as I took the beer in front of me, drinking it in one long gulp. The cold liquid burned as it went down. Mr. Parson walked over to an old, battered radio on the counter and turned it on. A raspy voice filled the room as Joe Cocker's "You Can Leave Your Hat On" began to play, its sultry rhythm making my heart pound even harder. He dragged a creaky wooden chair to the middle of the room, settling into it with a grin that made my stomach churn. "Dance for me," he said, his voice low but firm, his eyes glinting with expectation. I have to confess that at first I felt embarrassed. Suddenly, I felt possessed and began to dance like I had years ago when I was in a dance school. In seconds, I went from stiff movements of embarrassment to expert movements. Mr. Parson's gaze was steady, his eyes following every little movement I made, which only made my cheeks burn. Maybe it was the alcohol bubbling in my veins. Maybe it was the absurdity of the situation, or the way his undivided attention made me feel strangely powerful. Whatever it was, I felt the tension ease a little, my movements becoming more fluid. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the tones of the music fill the space between us. I let my hips sway naturally, my arms following the rhythm. The embarrassment didn't go away, but it dimmed, replaced by a strange mix of defiance and determination. As the song reached its climax, I looked up at him, his gaze intensifying. His chest rose and fell more rapidly, his lips parted slightly, as if he were panting. The air between us crackled with an electric tension that gave me goosebumps. The music suddenly ended, leaving only silence. For a moment, we stared at each other. Him in his worn chair, me standing awkwardly in the middle of his messy living room. Then, without warning, he stood up and closed the distance between us. His hands came up to cup my face gently, but firmly. "You're exquisite," he murmured. That was unexpected, and I didn't know how to respond. I just nodded, trying to gather my thoughts as he walked over to the record player. Then, that soft melody began to fill the room, as if someone had lit a match in the silence. I watched as he turned toward me, his step slow, and when he held out his hand, I felt a strange mix of surprise and curiosity. "Would you dance with me?" I hesitated a moment, looking into his eyes. There was something there, something deeper than the surface of this moment. Finally, I put my hand in his. His fingers were warm, a little fragile but firm. When we began to move, there was an awkwardness at first, the kind that comes from two people who aren't used to each other. But soon, the rhythm carried us, smoothing out the hesitation. I became acutely aware of how his hand rested on mine, how his touch was deliberate but gentle. For a moment, I forgot the unpaid rent, the awkwardness of the situation, and even the age that separated us. In that small space, it was just him and me, swaying to the music. When the song ended, he led me to the couch, his movements careful, as if he didn't want to disturb the fragile connection between us. He brought over a bottle of wine, poured 2 glasses of wine, and handed one to me, his fingers brushing mine briefly. "You're not like the others," he said, his voice somewhat raspy. "I have a dark past. You've probably heard the rumors about me," he added. "I was waiting for you to come knocking on my door to tell me you couldn't pay and collect the rent another way." I looked at him, not knowing what to say. His words took me by surprise. Before he knocked on the door, I even imagined lowering myself to pay the rent. He began to tell me about his life. As we drank our wine, I found myself listening intently, drawn to his words. It was strange, comforting even. When he reached out and let his hand rest on mine, I didn't pull away. His touch was light, almost hesitant, as if he wasn't sure I would allow it. But I did. There was something tender about that simple gesture, something that spoke louder than any words. "You're kind," he said softly, his thumb tracing soft circles on the back of my hand. I smiled slightly. The room felt smaller, warmer. I wasn't sure what would happen next, but I wasn't afraid to find out. My rent problem took a back seat, and though I didn't want to admit it, every minute I got to know more about Mr. Parson made me look at him in a different light. I even imagined what would have happened if he collected rent differently. But everything changed suddenly when he looked at his watch. His entire demeanor changed in an instant. The softness of his voice hardened, and his hand released mine as he straightened up in his seat. "You have to go now," he said firmly, his tone completely different than it had been moments ago. I blinked, surprised. He shook his head, avoiding my gaze as he stood up. "I'll give you more time to figure out the rent, and starting tomorrow, you can help with the cleaning. But for now, you have to go." The sudden change left me feeling both confused and oddly relieved. He wasn't angry, but his abrupt change in tone made it clear that the moment was over. I stood up slowly. "It's okay," I said quietly. Whatever had just happened, it was clear that he wasn't ready to let me fully into his world. And for now, that was enough. I would be back tomorrow to help with cleaning and find out what was coming next. On my way out, there was a tenant sitting on the steps who seemed so amused by my situation. The woman on the stairs gave me a mischievous smile and winked before speaking. "I hope you wore him out," she purred, her voice low and conspiratorial. "I have to keep him company right now," she said, making air quotes. As I walked back to my apartment, a mix of emotions washed over me. Curiosity and a bit of unexpected excitement for what might happen next. What's next? I wondered as I laid back in bed, staring at the ceiling. What deal does that woman have with Mr. Parson? A large part of me was reassured about the rent issue, but another part of me hoped Mr. Parson would charge me rent like he did that woman. Just as I was lost in my thoughts, I heard a soft knock on my door. Maybe he came to collect, I thought, laughing to myself. But for now, I would have to wait to find out. After all, with him, nothing was as it seemed.